Welcome. Today we're going to get into creating out a sports poster about Anthony Edwards. I've taken a couple images from Google to help assist with the collage today, but we're going to be using a combination of Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator to help assemble the full composition. We're going to start in Adobe Illustrator, and we're going to begin with a 11 by 14 document. I can click on top navigation print, or just type in making sure that we have inches set for our width and height to 11 by 14. I'm going to hit create. And with create, we're going to look to start by clicking on our pen tool. With our pen tool, I'm going to click a point for our line. Hold down shift to get a perfectly straight vertical line. And then once I have the 2 points, I can hit escape to end my line, and we can get into the modification of it. Understand that I do have the Essentials Classic layout for Adobe Illustrator. I like to have the panels over on the right side as well as the double panel on the left side for all my tools. But we're going to look to now modify it using our stroke panel over on the right side navigation. If I up my stroke, right now we can see a little bit more thickness to the design, but we're going to do some modifications to this. Down at the bottom of our stroke panel, we'll see profile, or say it's currently uniform, and we're going to switch this out to a width profile 4. With profile 4, you're going to see that it gets from thin to thick, but I do want to reverse this, so I'm going to go down to the bottom of the stroke panel again and hit flip along, so it mirrors and then flips upside down, so the thicker part is down at the bottom. Next, we're going to look to select over on our dash line in the stroke panel. When I click on it, we're going to look to set our settings for dash to 0.3 and then our gap to 30 points. The one big issue right now is that if I zoom in, we can see that they are just dashed lines happening inside of the stroke, but we're going to switch our cap at the top of our stroke panel so that they become rounded shapes. With that rounded shape, the big thing to make sure when we get into setting up our strokes is that we only want to be dealing with a stroke. If you do see a white box over on the left side navigation on your fill, we want to eliminate out the fill so we only have the black stroke. Once we do eliminate out the fill, I can up my stroke a little bit more. I'm just going to push it up to about 12 points. With that 12 points, we're then going to look to get into modifying out this stroke. Currently, if we do get into trying to create some radial effect, we do have the bottom of our contextual taskbar to repeat objects, but we want to add a little bit more interest rather than just having a flat straight line. So to create more interest, we're going to go up to Effect at the top navigation. Under Effect, we'll go into the Illustrator effects and click on Warp. With Warp, we're going to click on the arc. And you'll notice that when I do choose on the arc, I'm currently having a negative 50% bend. There is no horizontal and vertical distortion, but this bend allows us to create a curve shape on the design. So when I do have this negative 50% bend, I'm going to click OK. And then the important thing to understand is that if I were to try rotating this object, it would start to distort out the shape, which I don't want. Instead, what we're going to look to do is expand this object so that we get the line appearing along the stroke of these dots. So we're going to go to Object, Expand Appearance, and now it just has the dots selected out. Now I want to look to rotate this on more of an angle. If I move my cursor to one of the outside corners, I can start to click and drag to the left. But if I hold down Shift, I can lock it into a 45-degree rotation. If I go too far, that's 90%, rotating it sideways or horizontal. If I go vertical, where we started, I just want to find the happy medium in between. If I'm holding Shift, it will lock in at 45%. So once I do have that 45%, you'll notice that I cannot go back to the radial effect down on the contextual taskbar, but we can still do the process. It's just a matter of going up to Object at the top navigation, Repeat, and Radial. When I click on radial, we get our start by showing us the 8 different sides of the same shape repeating around in a circle. But we're going to look to adjust over on the right side. I can start to click and drag upward to bring in more dots and start to compile them all closer together. As I click and drag, we can see that we can get them a lot more intensive, but I'm just going to reduce this to about 45 for my instances. And it does really start to play tricks on your mind because of how they are bending. Now they start to appear as if they're rotating off to the right, even though that they are bending off to the left. If we did want to get into scaling this or modifying this, it's important to understand that if you do not have your scale tool properly set, it can distort the shape as it is. If I double click on my scale tool over on the left side navigation, if I did not have my scale corners and scale strokes and effects selected, let me just show you as an example. If I were to try scaling this down, it could end up making the shapes a little bit wonky. But just understand, if I am using the scale tool, we always want to make sure the scale corners and scale strokes and effects are selected. Just double click on the scale tool, make sure that we're seeing scale corners, strokes, and effects. And I can modify it as needed. If I do want to make any modifications to this, I can do this a little bit later on. And we'll come back to see how we can use this to our advantage. Next, we're going to get into how we can use a blend tool to create out some graphic element. I'm just going to do vertical lines that run down the left side of the page. I'm going to go back over to the pen tool, left side navigation. I'm going to click a point over to the left side of the page and then move over to the right. And I can hit the escape button to end the line out. And then back into our stroke panel. We're going to look to modify out this stroke. Make sure that we do have a stroke actually on the object, or else you cannot access the stroke panel. So I'm going to flip it so I have the black for right now, but will change the color eventually. And down to the profile, I'm going to look to change this out again, in which we're going to select out a width 5, width profile 5, and again I am going to invert this or flip it so that the thicker side is on the left. With this one stroke, I can look to create out a duplicate. To create out a duplicate, I am going to hold down Alt, click and drag down toward the bottom of the page. And we can always adjust the size later on. But with these two objects selected, I can either select on both pieces, clicking, drag, and cross, hold Shift, select on both. I'm going to look to use our blend tool. Our blend tool, we can either use the left side navigation where we have the icon that blends from a square to a circle, or we can go up to Object and Blend to choose out our blend tool. Whichever one it is, we're going to look to select on both objects. If I do up the top navigation, Object Blend, I have to have the object selected on my screen. So I can click on one, hold Shift, click on the other. Then we can go to Object, Blend, and Make. With the Make right now, I really need to get into the settings of my blend tool. Two different ways of doing this. We can go to Object, down to Blend, and hit Blend Options. Or you can double click on the blend tool on the left side navigation. With the object right now, it's set to smooth color. We're going to switch to specified steps. With specified steps, this is a lot right now, and I'm going to switch this out to 50 just to see how it looks. Do not click OK, just check and recheck preview just to make sure that you see how the design looks for you. I'm going to add a little bit more, so I'll put it up to 75. Still gives us this variation of lines, but make sure that it's selected so you can see what it looks like. If I do want to do modification to this line rather than just having a stagnant same shape happening every time, if I want to go into isolation mode, double clicking on the bottom line, I'm going to look to pull in the side of it so that I shrink down the left side and the right side will maintain its size. But you notice that because I'm scaling down on the bottom one, it's affecting all the lines above until it gets back to the original version that we have on the top. So again, if I do want to modify this with the object selected, I'm going to double click on either the top or bottom shape and just see this a little bit closer. I can move my cursor to the side, look to click and drag this outward to scale it up or scale it down to my preference. So once I'm satisfied with that design, I can double click out of it. The final element that we're going to be taking a look at is how to create blob circles together. With the blob circles, I'm going to go over to the left side navigation, click on our circle shape, click and drag to create out a circle. I'm going to look to change out my fill just to maintain consistency of the color of the Anthony Edwards Timberwolves design. I'm going to look to place in a picture to help me out with the look and feel of the design. I'm going to look to select out the Timberwolves logo and just use it as a way of referencing the color scheme if I do not have the color scheme with me. So with my circle selected, I can use the eyedropper tool, match the green that we have of the Timberwolves. I'm also going to then hold down Alt or Option to click and drag to create a duplicate circle. I'm going to scale this down so it just overlaps a little bit. But to help us really make sure that these two are visibly changing, I am going to add this green color as a gradient. So I'm going to click and drag this green onto the gradient slider. And instead of black, I'm going to look to use the blue of the Timberwolves logo. So if I click on the eyedropper tool, I can sample the blue from the logo. So I get a transition right now of green to blue. And we can always modify this later on if it doesn't look good for what we're trying to do. But to create out the blob in which it rounds out the corners when the two circles overlap, with them both selected, we're going to go over to our Pathfinder tool. To select our Pathfinder tool, if you do not see it over on the right side navigation, you can always go up to Window in alphabetical order, choose out our Pathfinder. But the icon is this two overlapping squares. I'm going to go to the top right corner and choose Make Compound Shape, in which it selects out both and combines them. Yes, they are two separate pieces, but now they are picking up the blend on both objects. Next, we're going to go over to our Appearance panel with the two circles still selected. In the Appearance panel, we're going to go to FX, down to Path and Offset Path. With Offset Path, we're going to set our settings to either 0.1389 inches, which is 10 points. If I don't want to go based off of inches, I can always just type in 10 pt and it will automatically switch into the 1 inch setting. But the important part is that we're going to change where it says joins to round. This allows us to get the curved element even though we still have another step to do. We're going to click OK. And then we're going to actually repeat this process with one difference. I'm going to again go down to FX at the bottom of the Appearance panel, back down to Path and Offset Path. Pop-up will come up saying, do you want to apply a new effect? Yes, we do. And this time, maintaining the same offset, we're going to slightly change it so it's a negative. So I can add a minus symbol before the numbers. And again, we are going to change this out to round. And when I do change this to round, if I take a closer look, just to cancel it out and take a little bit closer look. If I go FX and go to Path and Offset Path, when I apply this effect, again, we're going to do a negative offset, but when I do the negative, I want you to take a close look at the edges of these two circles. On both sides, it's going to round out and create a blob effect. So I'm just going to add a minus symbol. Nothing happens until I switch over to a round. And when I do the round, I click in and we can see this curved aspect happening on both the circles. So now when I click OK, now we have this blended two circles together. If I do want to modify this, or if I want to add in circles later on, what I want to do is go to double click and go into isolation mode, in which I can click and drag, and you see this blend happening between the objects. If I move it further away, they can disconnect, but you can really experiment and see how you can translate these circles into something a little bit more interesting and creative. If I want to add in circles, I can hold down Alt or Option, click and drag to create out more circles. It's just a matter of experimenting, seeing how the circles can continue around, and I can change different sizes to get different effects and different feels for the design. So you could add as many circles as you like, but we're going to keep to just these 4 for today, just so we can see how it gets affected. If I did want to change this overall look and feel, I always could just sample out a color from the logo. We can see that it does still apply as a design aspect, and I may look to keep this as one consistent color, as this green. For my circles and my lines over in left side navigation, I don't want to keep them as black. I want to maintain consistency to what's going on with the Timberwolves color scheme. So instead of black, we are going to switch this out to the blue of the Timberwolves logo. So with this selected, I could use the eyedropper tool. But we would have to go into isolation mode to select out one of them. If I want to get a sample of this color, I may need to draw out a box just to make it a little bit more accurate. I'm going to click on that dark blue. I can copy the hex number, double clicking on the fill color, Control C, and hit OK. And again, if I want to change these colors out, just a matter of going into isolation mode, choosing out one of the columns, and it should affect all of the designs. So if I wanted to see a different color, just as a sample, I'll sample out the lighter blue. Again, I'm going to double click on one of them, choose out that one. But again, we want to get the hex number at the bottom of the color picker, hit OK. And with this one selected, I'm going to paste in the new hex number, and it does affect all of those circles around the outside of the shape. Finally, for the last one, these lines over on the left side, I'm going to again sample out, this time the gray color. So just to pick out another color scheme, just drawing out a square shape, I can use the eyedropper to pick out the gray matching to the Timberwolves logo. So again, I do want to match to this specific hex number. I'm going to hit Control or Command C, copy it. Then I'm going to look to select out both the top and bottom. Right now I'm only seeing a black stroke, but we're going to switch this out to the gray. So double clicking on the stroke panel, not the fill, I'm going to hit Command or Control V, pasting it in, and now those are gray strokes instead. So with these now created out, we can look to bring these over to our Photoshop and start to compile the actual poster. In Photoshop, I am going to look to create out a 11 by 14 document. We're going to go File, New. In the document size, I can change my inches for the width to 11, and height is going to be 14. It's going to say at 300 ppi, the resolution, and keep to a white background, and I can click OK. Now, rather than saving this individually as separate pieces, I can look to click and drag these pieces over to our Photoshop. To do that, what I'm going to do is select on the circles in the top right that I first did, click and drag them with the selection tool over to the document of Photoshop. Just a matter of making sure that you can do a split screen, have enough room that we can carry this over. Next, we're going to look to bring over the other elements. Click on the green circles. And again, we may change the color scheme. It's just a matter of figuring out what works for us. But I can hit enter for now. And finally, the last element, the gray lines over on the left, click and drag over to our design. So we can always get into tweaking this and modifying out later on. But now it's a matter of compiling the actual images that we need for the poster. And I have already assembled or grabbed a couple of the images. First, we do need the Minnesota logo, so I'm going to look to click on the magic wand tool, click on the white background. I'm going to invert the selection so it only gets around the logo itself. And then I can use the selection tool, or the move tool at the top navigation, click and drag this over to our document and drop it on. We can always scale this down, make it a little bit smaller, and focus this, or look to modify this later on. I do want to incorporate the Minnesota skyline, and you'll have access to this image, but with separating the background, it's not the highest quality image. If I were looking to use my contextual taskbar to select this out, or trying to select out the subject, it's not very accurate when it comes into selecting out just the overall area. But if I were trying to select it out, I may want to consider trying to use the object select. I can try clicking, dragging. Just understand that we do have to have the layer selected. If I tried clicking on select subject, it is not exactly the most accurate when it comes to selecting out the buildings. But there is a cheat in how to select this area out. And we're not going to use the entire thing, but we do want the buildings towards the top of the page. So instead, rather than using the select subject, I'm going to deselect, and we're going to go up to Edit, down to Sky Replacement, which the Sky Replacement does a great job of recognizing the buildings in the background versus the sky itself. So just as a sample, I can see what this looks like as is. I'm just going to pick out a standard blue sky. But when I do click OK on the sky replacement, it is going to create out a number of layer masks that we can help to use to assemble our design. So over in the layers panel, I'm going to look to that sky layer that is created out for me. I'm going to take the mask of the sky layer and drag it onto layer 1, our bottom layer. Then we're going to take layer 1 and put it above our sky replacement layer. With this, I'm going to look to hide everything below our layer 1. We're going to select on the layer mask, and you're going to hit Control-I or Command-I to invert the selection and get the transparency of the cityscape. So we no longer have a sky, but we have the separation that we're looking for. So with this layer, I can lock them together so that they're linked. Move my cursor between the two thumbnails of the layer mask and the actual image. And then I can use the move tool to click and drag it over to our 11x14 document. And again, yes, we will eventually cut out some areas. If we do have any areas that are running out, I can always click on the layer mask to erase out so it doesn't become a distraction, or we're just cleaning it up so it looks more professional. With the eraser tool, I can use a larger brush to erase out this top line that I'm seeing. And again, we can always erase out some areas later on, but we'll save it for right now. Next, we have 3 images of Anthony Edwards. With Anthony Edwards, when it comes into selecting it, the easiest one to work with is going to be this Timberwolves where he's about to shoot the ball. We can go down to our contextual taskbar and click on Select Subject. When we do select subject, it's not perfect. There are a couple areas that we need to fix, whether it's in between cutting off some of the shirt, or adding an area that wasn't part of the shirt that wasn't added, or just refining the hairs on his head. To do this, I first want to take a closer look. So I'm going to Control plus sign, zoom in. I see that some of the white was being cut off. So I'm going to go over to my lasso tool. You can use the polygon lasso tool if you feel, or you don't feel as comfortable drawing with the regular lasso tool. But I'm going to hold down Alt or Option and look to draw around the area that I want to add back into the selection. So just to be clear, when it does come into drawing it out, we're going to hold down Shift actually and draw around the area that we want to be part of the selection. Holding down Shift adds in the area that we want. Alt will cut out the areas that we don't want. Alt or Option. So that adds that little piece of white. We still have a little piece of white here. Again, I'm going to hold down Alt. I'd hold down Shift to add this area in, so it's part of the selection. Just check around the edges of the rest of his uniform, his arms, making sure that the subject is completely selected. And I will notice that there is some areas on the hair that we do need to refine. So to touch this area up, we can go up to Select at the top navigation and select and mask. It gets a little bit tricky because we are dealing with a black background with black hair. But it's a matter of just taking your time and understanding that we have to look for the little details to make sure that they all work together. I'm going to look to change out my view, just make sure that I'm setting it up to overlay so I can see it a little bit better. If you are dealing with a black background, you may want to consider the onion skin, but it really depends on your preference. Over on the left side navigation, we're going to click on the Refine Edge tool, the second tool, which it looks like it's modifying out hairs, these little strands. I'm going to shrink down the size of my brush just about 10% or to 10 points. I want to make sure that I'm cleaning up the areas, bringing back some hair strands around the edge of his hair. It may not be perfect. I may need to touch up some areas, but make sure you do not go into the skin. We don't want to deselect out the skin by accident. If we do end up erasing some areas, we could always experiment with choosing out our brush tool. With the brush tool, the idea still works in which I can start to paint in areas that might be part of his hair. And I'm just looking for that separation between the really dark black that's happening in the background of the image. I'm going to go back over the Refine Edge tool and take a closer look to the top strands of his hair. Make sure not to go into the hair itself. I only have my cursor about halfway over top of the hair, just so we can add in some strands. But because it's a lower quality image and we have that darker background, it's harder to get everything that we could want. If I do want to add in some areas, again, I could switch over to the brush tool. I see a little bit of red that I want to get rid of. And just with the standard brush tool, we can look to paint in some areas back in. Once we get our subject selected out, we're going to look to click OK at the bottom. We can either add a layer mask now, or I could just use the move tool to slide him over to my untitled background and the document. So we'll come back to in a little bit. The other two images that we have, one of him celebrating or showing some emotion, and then the other one him dunking. The one of him dunking I've set up already, in which we've cut out the subject. It would be a little bit time consuming to get all the little pick areas. But just understand that it's looking to clean up the area around the subject. Select subject is not perfect, so it has been touched up enough that it works for our design. I can use the move tool to click and drag him up to our design itself. So again, I'm just going to drag him over. Just accidentally hit a button. But just dropping into the picture, we'll get into modifying him so he stands out a little bit better. And we can play with distortions of colors so that they separate each other from the design. Finally, let's get our picture of him celebrating. Again, we can look to use our select subject. Again, the background is not perfect, and there are some areas that we need to touch up. So I'm going to start by looking around the bottom edges. A couple areas I can see it's not adding in the blue. I can use the lasso tool to draw out adding in areas. I can hold down Shift, click and drag down the edge of the pants to add them in part of the selection. Inside the gap of the arm and pants, I need to hold down Alt to click and drag through the subject, cutting out the area that isn't part of the uniform. I can hold down Shift if I want to add in some of his arm again. Just clean up the area. It's not the highest quality image, that's why we're getting a little bit of pixelation. It's not the smoothest edges, but take your time to try to clean it up as best possible. Make sure to look at both sides. I can see that I do have a couple areas over on the right here that I need to separate. They're on the left. Holding down Alt, I'm going to click and drag to erase out and deselect the area of the shirt I don't want, or the gap in between the arm and shirt that I don't want. I can always add in areas if I've drawn missing some spots. Click and drag through. Or down the side of his shirt, adding in this area so it's part of the selection. Again, hold down Alt or Option to deselect out areas. Now taking a look, checking the head, checking around the shoulders, making sure that we're not missing any parts of the uniform or his body. Just again, cleaning up towards the pant area. So once I have these areas selected out, I can add a layer mask. see how it is with the background. If there's any areas I need to clean up, touch up, I can look to either paint them in and go over the brush tool. That's when I clean up his arms a little bit, get a sharper edge. If I accidentally go too far, I could always use the eraser to erase out some areas. So it is just a little bit soft around the edges. So it's something just to make sure it looks as professional as possible. Again, the eraser tool, if I need to erase out any areas, just make sure you have a hard brush. Again, I don't like how soft it is around the edge of the hair. I'm just sharpening it up to make it look more professional, as if it were part of the image. So again, just seeing some soft edges around the forearms as well. Making sure that this is cleaned up a little bit better. We'll be ready to zoom in, get close, make sure that we're as accurate as possible. So once we have the subject all cleaned up, we can look to use the move tool and bring him over to the rest of our design. For our design, we want to think about how we can use all these elements, or maybe add in more elements to really pull it all together and make this interesting. I first want to think about my main subject. The most interesting and dynamic shot is obviously him dunking. So I'm going to look to scale him up. I can hit Command or Control T to scale him up and make this the main portion of the poster. Individual pictures, make sure that you have your auto select on. I click on each picture and be able to look to adjust, make it bigger, smaller, based on what I'm trying to do. For my shooting subject, I'm going to look to place this green blob behind. I'm going to scale it down a little bit. Make sure not to hold shift, maintain proportions. And you may have to do distortment or adjust certain aspects. I may want to look to scale up certain features. Or scale down certain features, depending on what you're trying to do. For my shooting subject, we're going to try getting a little bit more creative with this design, looking to cut out the bottom portion of the subject without cutting off the ball. What I mean by this is we're going to select on these green circles. I can go over to the layer panel over on the layers panel. I'm going to hold down Control or Command, click on the vector smart object that we have. Then we're going to go over to our subject, the picture of him holding the basketball. With this tool, we're going to click on the layer mask. I'm going to invert the selection so that I can erase out the bottom portion of this without erasing out the ball. So to do this, I may want to consider bringing up the size of my subject. I'm going to click off it for a second just to make him a little bit bigger. Command or Control T. I'm going to make sure that his shoulder or elbow isn't cutting into the area. But with this area selected, I'm then going to, again, select on the chemical shape that we created out, holding down Command or Control. Then I'm going to use the eraser tool on the layer mask of our, we'll call this Edwards 3, or Edwards shot. We're going to click on the layer mask. Before we do anything, we're going to invert our selection so that we can erase out the bottom portion of his pants so it gets consolidated inside of the circle shape. So to do that, we're going to use the eraser tool and go bigger with the brush. And as I click and drag, you start to see the pants start to erase out. Yes, I do want to avoid the basketball, or if I do erase the basketball, just understand that we want to bring the basketball back. So I'm going to go over to the paintbrush, like the bigger brush. I can actually make this circle as big of as the basketball. We can see that we can get the circle of the basketball pretty accurate. If it's not perfect, just understand we can adjust the size of the brush manually. But now when I select off of him, now the subject looks like he's coming from inside the circle. For the subject of him showing some motion, again, I want to scale him up, make him bigger. It's not that we need to see all of him, so I'm going to look to move him behind the dunking subject. And again, we're going to look to select the subject. I'm going to hold down Control to select on the green shape again, holding Alt or holding Control or Command. Brings back in the circle shape. And we can look to erase out the bottom portion. I have to invert the selection, click on the eraser tool. I can start to erase out his pants area. You have to be careful because if there are some areas, we have this little green circle happening on our design, I may want to consider erasing out this part of the green circle if it's interfering with the design overall, or just understanding that I have to move him a little bit to make it work for this placement. So if I deselect, I'm going to again erase out the area of the subject. Click on the eraser tool. I'm going to make sure to select on the layer mask so I can erase out the bottom portion of his pants. If I do erase out too much, we can always paint it back in certain areas. But just a matter of understanding where you're at and what we're trying to select. Again, I'm going to go over to the paintbrush, just clean this area up. But having these two background pictures can become a distraction for the overall look and feel of the design. We have to think about how we can help create attention and emphasis on a key image, particularly the one of him dunking. So I'm going to look to maintain him in the full color on the front image, but maybe play with creating out a modification to the subjects over in the background. So just to experiment and test this out, I'm going to look to select on my layer 4, which I'm going to call him Edward's Emotion. I'm going to duplicate out this layer, right click on the layer, and duplicate at the top. The reason why I duplicate it, I'd like to always have a backup just in case I mess something up or I want to change something later on. We can always step back. But I'm going to right click on this layer and apply layer mask. So we have the effect, we have this color seeping behind the design. Now what we're going to look to experiment with is going into a monotone look and feel. So I can consider going into a black and white variation or desaturating out the color. It takes away the color from the subject, but I do want to push it up or have a tone that matches better to the rest of the design. So if I go into hue and saturation and I click colorize, we can look to bring in some color onto him. And you have to figure out what works for the design, what's going to take away, or what's may not work overall. But I also have to consider that I have to probably apply effects to make him stand out better in the color tone. The sepia tone, you get that more yellowish color, but I want more of a blue to go with the background. Or I can consider more of a gray to fade him out a little bit. Right now he's a little bit dark for what I'm trying to get across. So if I do want to lighten him up, I don't want to go into the lightness section. But I'm going to just hit cancel for right now. It's still a black and white image. I'm going to go to adjustments and brightness and contrast. And with brightness and contrast, I can look to bring up the brightness so he stands out a little bit better. With contrast, I can push up the contrast so we're getting more of this gray tone happening over the subject. In that same regard, I do want to do that to the other photo. So again, I'm going to duplicate out this layer. And I'm going to right click on the layer mask and apply layer mask and hide out the original. With this one, again, we're going to go image, adjustments, and desaturate. You can always hit Control-Shift-U. But again, create out a little bit more contrast. I'm going to go up to image, adjustments, and brightness. Push up the brightness a bit. And I'm going to push the contrast up. This helps to create a little bit more attention on the dunking subject. But a couple other elements that we want to consider. We have this blue background that we originally brought in. We want to think about how we can tie this into the rest of the design. and it might be focusing around the basketball itself, it might be focusing on the basketball from the bottom, but think about the placement that's going to help enrich the overall look and feel. So if I need to scale it down and focus on the ball in his hand, I can draw attention to that aspect. These lines over on the gray side, I'm going to look to pull down underneath of our green aspect. If I need to scale it out, I can hit Command or Control T. Just make sure you have the layer selected. I can always play with size and scale, so we can create some attention. But for myself, I'm going to drop this down one more, just so it's not interfering with the design. And I also may consider rotating or reflecting this. So if I hit Command T, I can right click and flip vertical, so it goes from having the lines at the bottom instead of the top. This way it's not taking a distraction from the top portion of the page. The cityscape we're going to look to use on the bottom of our design. The bottom of the design, I'm going to again hit Command T. I can scale it up to run across the bottom portion of the entire picture. I, again, just want to focus on the buildings being a connection to Minnesota where he plays. And I don't want to have all this color because it becomes a distraction. So again, I am going to duplicate out the layer just to make sure I don't want to change anything later on. But I'm going to right click on the layer mask, apply layer mask. And then again, we're going to see what happens when we get into the gray tone. So I go down to desaturate, eliminates out the color. And again, if I do want to try picking up some color tones, I could look to colorize. I'm going to take a sample of the blue from the inside of the logo. Because that's not working, I might have to just eye it. And saturation, I'm going to pull up a little bit more. I don't want to overwhelm on the design, so I may fade this out or look to drop the color a little bit. I can take a look at the blend modes to see how they affect. We're going to look to add a layer mask. Adding a layer mask to the layer itself, we're going to click on the gradient tool in the left side navigation. Clicking on the gradient tool, located in the same place as the bucket. We're going to change my gradient to a black and white gradient, standard gradient. The reason why I'm doing this is I'm going to click on a linear gradient and have the gradient fade out on the bottom portion. So it's just casting a little bit of a highlight on the bottom of the area. If you didn't want to put a layer mask, I could always create out just a new blank layer and apply this gradient effect. But instead of being a black and white gradient, it would be a transparent white gradient. My fill was set to red, that's why we were seeing the red for momentarily. But I do want to give some separation to our subject. Getting our subject, I can consider adding in a drop shadow to our subject about to dunk. We'll call this Edward's dunk. I'm going to look to go FX and drop shadow. With the drop shadow, I'm going to push up the settings a little bit more. The distance is going to stay relatively close, but the size is going to help blur out and really draw separation between the background subjects. To make more of a connection down to representing the city of Minnesota, I'll put the Minnesota, or the city of Minneapolis, I'll put the Minnesota logo down with the cityscape. And with the top portion, I'll consider adding in text to help tie in connecting, identifying who our subject is. Obviously, Anthony Edwards, if you did not know. So I'm going to look to go over to my type tool. With the text box, I'm going to draw out a text box that fills in across the page. And I'm going to type in Anthony Edwards. I'm going to highlight across to make my text. Right now I can use the eyedropper tool to match out the blue. Instead of the font that we're seeing, we're going to take a look at A4. Something a little bit more aesthetically dynamic. I'm going to highlight across his name and look to scale up the size of the font. Click and drag across. I'm dragging across on the icon for our font size at the top navigation, just making Anthony and Edwards all the way across on the top. If I want to consolidate the space between Edwards, I'm going to highlight the Edwards text and go over to my right side navigation. In the right side navigation, I go over to my leading and click and drag to the left to reduce the space down. I don't want to necessarily have this text overwhelming the rest of the design, so I am probably going to look to modify it by adding in this as a stroke with no fill. So what that means, I'm going to look to add FX and go to stroke. To get the stroke color, I can sample eyedropping the blue that I have for the font itself. It's going to appear on the outside of the text. Can't really see anything happen, but what we're actually going to do is click OK for right now. And I'm going to drop the fill from 100% over in the top of the right layer of the layers panel and drop it to 0% so that we're getting Anthony Edwards with just a stroke effect. If I do want to modify the stroke, make it a little bit thicker, I can double click on the stroke panel and look to adjust. I do want to have an actual fill, what I may want to consider is changing rather than a blue color. I could consider going to white and then dropping the opacity. So it creates out more of a ghosting effect. If I want to play with size and text, I can look to scale down some fonts. It's all about experimentation, seeing what you can create, what will be the dynamic for the overall vision. Just to tie in elements from who he is, what he does for the team, I might be adding in elements that make him who he is. I'll probably put in number 5. He is wearing the more classic uniform, but if we go to the more modern variation, we can look at the font that Timberwolves use in the logo and on the standard uniform every day. I'm going to put in the number 5, change it out to Geometos. Geometos, I can pick out the regular font. And again, I'm going to look to add in a stroke effect. I can copy the layer style from the text of Anthony Edwards and paste this effect onto the number 5. If I hit Control or Command T, I can look to scale this up, making it a lot larger. But you want to make sure that the text box is visible or easy to shrink or modify as needed. Placement wise, I don't want to have it in his face or blocking out the green, so I'm going to drop this down below. But I'm going to put the opacity back up for the fill, so it does cover up the background graphics and allows the 5 to stand out a little bit better. So there's many ways to experiment with this, but we're looking to just help the subject stand out, adding in these different emotions, different poses, gives an all-around sense of who he is. If I do want to help enhance this photo a little bit better, I think the color and contrast can be pushed a little bit more vibrant. Going up to adjustments, I'm going to make sure I have the dunk image selected. I go up to image adjustments, brightness and contrast. I'm going to push the contrast up higher and push the brightness up, just so he stands out again a little bit stronger. It's a little bit more vibrant in the color scheme. Any other aspects that I want to change out or modify, I can look to click and drag or change them out. For the name, I'm not necessarily happy with the way the effect's working out, so I may want to consider modifying that. Try out a couple different things, just to help enhance it better. I could try a couple of different effects, maybe add in a gradient to make it more dynamic. I don't like it overall, but that's why we experiment, seeing what works, what does not. Maybe instead of a gradient overlay, I just go to full color. And realizing I may not have to go necessarily big to get it across who he is and identify how it can work. I like having his name stronger up on the top left by itself. Having the 5 kind of just be an accent to his name. But it connects better and leaves open space, allows it to breathe a little bit more. Other areas that I may want to consider modifying, I don't like the overlap with the green happening over here. What I'm going to look to do is modify out the actual vector smart object. If I double click in Illustrator, I'm going to move this location of the dot. If I click and drag this up, I can change the placement. Think about where it works, where it may not. Or maybe adding in more dots to create more interest in the design. So just as a sample, if I do this through Illustrator, because I double clicked on the vector smart object, when I hit Control S to save it, and I go back to my design, it will modify the design to alter the shape or alter the placement of that design overall. It's just a matter of replacing it in to where I want. Now we have the overall look and feel for the Anthony Edwards poster. Good dynamic, drawing in attention. We have identification of who he is, the number helping reflect it. Couple images of him. If I did want to test it out or experiment, I could consider, again, trying to see what the blue tone might look like, just as a sample so we can see it. If I go up to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, I click on Colorize, instead of a blue, or instead of red, I'll go out to blue color. Remember, it's going to be 205 and 25. Or if I want the saturation to go up, we're going to have a little more vibrant. And then again, on this same image, I'll duplicate it out just so we can see the difference. Having this blue tone just picks up to the rest of the color scheme. So image adjustments, hue and saturation. Click on colorize, and I'll switch it out to 205 so we can see how it looks. If the green and blue aren't working, consider modifying out the colors. But now I can get a good comparison from the blue version that we just did to the just gray version that we had. So if I wanted to see the gray version versus the blue version, I can see which one works better for my design overall. But that is going to be the design aspect for today. Hopefully you can take this and run many different ideas from it. Just to break down and see where we started from or how we built it into this. Look to clear out some layers so we can see how it built out. Start out with a white background. Have our line effect just to add some accent. The blue circle that will eventually wrap around the balls. The green blend or morphed circles. The cityscape that we eventually turned to a black and white or a blue variation. To give it a little bit of fade so it didn't draw so much attention, I added in this gradient at the bottom. We added in the logo to connect to the city that we're using in sampling. Instead of just leaving it color versions, I decided to go with a black and white variation, and realizing that the blue tone helps to connect again more to the cityscape. We tried this as well for the top right side and switch it over to that blue tone as well. Finally, we have the dunk image. And just to draw more attention, we have our subject's name to identify who he is, and that little accent of number 5, his uniform number, to again make a correlation of who he is for the team. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.